It was late September 2025 when Keith Urban finally broke his silence. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, countless red carpets, and a love story the world thought would last forever, he finally said the words fans never expected to hear. For years, Keith and Nicole Kidman had been Hollywood's steady heartbeat, proof that fame didn't have to destroy love. They survived addiction, long tours, film shoots, and gossip. But behind every perfect photograph was a couple quietly drifting, held together by habit, history, and hope. And now, after signing the papers that ended their 19-year marriage, Keith finally admitted the truth. It wasn't betrayal, it wasn't scandal, it was something far more ordinary, and somehow far more devastating. He confessed that he blew it to smithereens, that he'd spent years chasing stages and applause, only to realize too late what he'd lost. And as his voice cracked in the interview that followed, he said something that changed how fans saw their entire love story. Because when Keith Urban finally revealed why his marriage to Nicole Kidman ended, it wasn't the story anyone expected. It was the kind that leaves even the most loyal hearts wondering how two people who loved so deeply could still lose each other in plain sight. It was January 2005 when two very different worlds collided at the G'day LA Gala in Hollywood. Nicole Kidman had already lived through the glare of fame and heartbreak, the Academy Award-winning actress, newly free, after a long public marriage to Tom Cruise. Keith Urban, born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, was Nashville's rising star, known for songs about redemption and the ache of longing. Their paths crossed that night under soft lights and cameras, but what no one knew was that both were standing at quiet turning points in their lives. Keith later said he almost didn't approach her. He'd been sober for just a short while, still carrying the weight of old habits and the pressure of newfound success. Nicole, guarded but curious, had told friends she wasn't looking for love, not yet. But when Keith finally walked over, what began as polite conversation stretched into something neither of them expected. There was recognition, a sense of safety. They shared roots, humor, and a deep love for Australia that reminded them of who they'd been before Hollywood rewrote their stories. Within months, their friendship deepened into romance. By May 2006, they were engaged, and 1 month later, they exchanged vows in a candlelit ceremony at St. Patrick's Estate in Sydney. The world saw a fairy tale, Nicole in ivory lace, Keith strumming his guitar at the altar. For her, it felt like a second chance. For him, it was the stability he'd never known. Yet even on that perfect night, Keith's closest friends whispered that he seemed fragile, almost overwhelmed by how much he suddenly had to lose. 4 months later, the cracks beneath the surface became clear. Keith checked himself into the Betty Ford Center seeking treatment for alcohol addiction, a relapse that nearly ended their marriage before it truly began. Nicole didn't leave. She flew to California, sat by his side, and told the press only that she loved her husband and believed in his recovery. Her devotion stunned fans, and even Keith's bandmates said they'd never seen him fight so hard to get better. The story turned from tabloid to testimony. Love as healing, not scandal. When he completed treatment in early 2007, Keith spoke about her with gratitude that bordered on awe. He called Nicole his miracle. They retreated from the spotlight, spending quiet months between Los Angeles and Tennessee. To outsiders, it looked like they'd conquered everything: addiction, distance, fame. But what few noticed was the cost of keeping that image alive. Nicole's career resumed almost immediately with film projects abroad, while Keith prepared for a major tour. Their time together shrank to fragments: airports, hotel rooms, and hurried goodbyes before another round of applause. Still, in those first years, their love felt invincible. Keith poured his feelings into songs like Making Memories of Us, written long before he met Nicole, but now dedicated to her on stage. She called him the love of my life, and every red carpet photo became proof that second chances could last. Yet underneath the romance was a quiet truth: neither wanted to face every time they reunited, they had to start over. The longer the separations grew, the harder it became to find their rhythm again. By the end of 2007, the fairy tale had already begun to fray, gently, silently, without drama or betrayal. What started as rescue had turned into rebuilding. And rebuilding takes more than love. It takes balance, something neither had learned to hold for long. Still, they kept smiling, believing love could outrun the past. But as Keith would later admit, that year taught him something he didn't want to believe at the time, that even miracles can fade if you're too busy chasing the next performance to see them slipping away. And as the tours grew longer and the cameras followed them less, the fairy tale began to drift, 1 mile, 1 stage, 1 film at a time. When Sunday Rose was born in July 2008, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman looked like they'd finally reached the calm they had fought so hard for. They settled into family life in Nashville, where neighbors described them as ordinary, grounded, protective. For the first time, Nicole took months away from acting, focusing on motherhood while Keith adjusted to touring with a newborn at home. Fans saw a gentler version of both, the country singer who once wrote about loneliness now singing lullabies backstage, and the Hollywood actress who once embodied icy perfection now photographed barefoot in Tennessee grass. But stillness was never built to last for two people whose lives depended on motion. By 2010, Keith's career was in full swing again, and Nicole had returned to film. That same year they welcomed their second daughter, Faith Margaret, via surrogacy, another blessing that arrived amid growing separation. Nicole filmed Rabbit Hole in New York, The Paperboy in Louisiana, then Grace of Monaco overseas. Keith's tour buses crisscrossed America, while his wife walked red carpets on the other side of the world. They built homes in Nashville, Los Angeles, and Sydney, but no single place ever felt permanent. Friends described them as devoted but exhausted. They would fly thousands of miles to spend 48 hours together, then disappear back into work. Every reunion felt like a new beginning, and every goodbye carried the quiet ache of starting over again. Keith once said he loved that Nicole was fiercely independent, but independence has a cost. The more she thrived in her world, the more he felt like a visitor in it. By 2012, their careers no longer overlapped, they orbited. Keith joined American Idol as a judge, anchoring him in Los Angeles, while Nicole spent months in France filming Grace of Monaco. They were still smiling for cameras, still exchanging loving messages online, but insiders began to notice what wasn't there. Fewer shared appearances, fewer interviews together, fewer moments that looked unscripted. Their love didn't collapse, it thinned. The intimacy that once came from crisis had nowhere to anchor itself in calm. When life stopped testing them, they realized they had forgotten how to simply be together. Nicole's interviews during those years were careful. She often spoke about gratitude, faith, and motherhood, rarely about marriage. Keith, on the other hand, poured fragments of that silence into his songs. Tracks like Cop Car and Break on Me carried traces of longing and apology, lyrics about distance, forgiveness, and the ache of missing someone who's still alive, still near, but already drifting. In one interview, Keith admitted that the hardest part of touring wasn't exhaustion. It was returning home and feeling like the outsider in his own life. He described sitting in his studio after shows, surrounded by noise, yet feeling alone. Nicole, meanwhile, told Vanity Fair that love requires patience and absence, a line that sounded poetic but hinted at reality. Absence had become their routine. By the mid-2010s, the photographs told the story before either of them did. Their smiles remained, but their body language changed. Less hand-holding, more polite distance. They were raising 2 daughters together, but emotionally they were already living apart. What makes this chapter so haunting is how ordinary it was. No betrayals, no explosive fights. Just 2 people stretched too thin between duty and desire. Fame didn't break them. Time did. And when Keith later looked back on those years, He described them as the slow unraveling. The love was still there, but it no longer felt like home. And yet, as their worlds kept spinning, the music told what the smiles could not, that something inside the marriage was quietly fading, note by note. By 2016, Keith Urban was at the peak of his career. His album Ripcord topped charts around the world, and his live shows sold out within minutes. The spotlight followed him everywhere, flashing lights, roaring crowds, endless interviews. To fans, he looked unstoppable. But fame, once a source of pride, had become a wall between him and the woman who once saved him. Nicole Kidman was experiencing her own resurgence. Her roles in Big Little Lies and Lion earned global praise and new awards. She was filming in California, London, and Italy, sometimes spending months away from home. When they appeared together at events, it looked like success personified. Two artists thriving in their own universes. Yet behind the glow of achievement was a truth neither could fix. They were no longer moving toward the same horizon. Their lives were perfectly parallel, and that was the problem. They supported each other publicly, but privately they had less and less to share. Keith once admitted that touring had become lonely and miserable, words that hit differently in hindsight. Those close to the couple recalled stretches when they went weeks witut being in the same city. Nicole kept filming, Keith kept performing, and both kept pretending that distance was normal. By 2018, the warmth that once felt effortless began to look rehearsed. Reporters described Nicole's proud appearances at Keith's award shows, but she often left quickly after. One witness told people that they smiled beautifully but barely spoke backstage. Even in interviews, when asked how they kept their marriage strong, their answers grew shorter. Rehearsed phrases about trust, respect, and humor replacing what used to be open affection. Keith's music during those years turned darker. Songs like Parallel Line and We Were carried the ache of unfinished conversations. Fans who listened closely heard the melancholy between verses, a man trying to reconcile success with emotional emptiness. Nicole, in contrast, gave interviews about discipline and faith. When asked about Keith, she often smiled and said, "We're both very busy, but we make it work." But they weren't making it work. They were maintaining the appearance of a marriage that had already changed shape. Friends close to the family described them as coexisting. The girls were thriving, but the parents were ghosts in each other's schedules. At home, Keith was quieter, often lost in his studio, while Nicole prepared for another shoot or overseas flight. In 2020, the pandemic briefly forced stillness. For the first time in years, the couple found themselves in the same house for months. At first it seemed to heal them: home-cooked meals, shared routines, long walks through their Nashville property. But quiet can be clarifying. When the noise of the world stopped, so did their ability to hide from what they'd become. The silences between them weren't peaceful anymore. They were loaded with everything left unsaid. After restrictions lifted, Keith returned to touring, and Nicole signed on for new projects. The momentary peace vanished. Keith later described that period as a reset that didn't hold. He said that after being together every day, returning to the road felt like starting over with a stranger. That was when friends noticed a shift: less joy in his interviews, fewer mentions of home. By 2022, something had broken quietly. They no longer celebrated anniversaries publicly. Their social media posts grew sparse, each message written as if for fans, not for each other. In photographs, the affection had softened into politeness. They had become symbols of endurance, not intimacy. When asked that year if his marriage inspired his music, Keith paused before answering, "Everything I write comes from truth." It was the closest he came to admitting what many already sensed: that love, even when real, can outlive its rhythm. And when that rhythm finally stopped, Keith knew the silence wasn't temporary. It was the sound of something ending. By 2023, the silence around Keith and Nicole had grown impossible to ignore. For years they had shielded their marriage from speculation. But absence speaks louder than denial. Keith was touring through Europe, his shows louder than ever, his smile just as bright, yet insiders described him as distant, subdued once the lights went down. Nicole, meanwhile, was in Australia filming Expats, a drama about loneliness and identity. The timing felt poetic, almost cruel. They were once again living on different continents, telling different stories about love that no longer matched their own. When he returned to Nashville that autumn, friends noticed a shift. The usual energy that defined him on stage was gone. His set lists grew more reflective, heavy with ballads and nostalgia. During one performance, he paused mid-song, visibly emotional, then whispered into the microphone, "You don't realize what you have until you stop running." It wasn't scripted. The crowd cheered, but those who knew him understood. That line wasn't about fame. It was about her. The following year brought his quiet reckoning. In early 2024, during a backstage interview, Keith finally broke his silence. Asked about his marriage, he didn't deflect or smile his way through the question. He exhaled, eyes tired, voice low. "I blew it," he said. Blew it to smithereens. For a man who'd spent decades guarding his private life, those words landed like thunder. He didn't elaborate then, but he didn't need to. It was a confession stripped of defense, one that held both regret and relief. Later, in a longer conversation for an Australian outlet, Keith clarified what he meant. It wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 little things. Tours, distance, promises I didn't keep. He admitted that somewhere between chasing music and maintaining a marriage, he lost the balance that once defined him. He said the applause filled the silence for a while, but eventually the noise turned hollow. "You start to confuse being wanted with being loved," he said, "and that's when you lose yourself." Nicole, true to form, stayed silent. She didn't contradict him, didn't offer her own version of events. The dignity that marked her entire career became her only statement. Sources close to her described the separation as inevitable, but heartbreaking. Both agreed on one thing: their daughters would come first. Their lawyers finalized the settlement quietly. No spousal support, no public bitterness. It ended as it began, with restraint. But for Keith, the confession wasn't about legal closure, it was about emotional honesty, a truth he'd spent years avoiding. He admitted he was never unfaithful, but he was absent, that his addiction to touring, to validation, to movement, became another form of escape. He said fame doesn't destroy love, neglect does. "I didn't mean to let go," he reflected, "but I kept choosing the stage over the silence that might have saved us." That statement changed everything for his fans. It wasn't the revelation of scandal, but of humanity. The kind of truth that hits harder because it's ordinary. The slow erosion that happens when two people stop turning toward each other. By the time the divorce papers were filed in late September 2025, there were no accusations left to make, just exhaustion. They released a joint statement, thanking the public for respect and privacy. But when Keith spoke alone a week later, he didn't hide behind legal phrasing. He said, "She'll always be the one who taught me what love costs." It was the line that echoed across headlines, quoted endlessly, dissected by fans who realized this wasn't just another celebrity split, it was the unraveling of a love story that once symbolized endurance, undone not by scandal, but by the quiet forgetting of how to stay present. And yet, in that same confession, Keith said something no one expected, something about Nicole herself that revealed the truth behind every heartbreak he'd ever sung about. When Keith Urban finally spoke about Nicole Kidman, not the actress, not the icon, but the woman he'd shared 19 years of his life with, his voice changed. Gone was the rehearsed confidence that had carried him through press tours and award shows. What came through instead was humility. "She saved me," he said simply. And sometimes when someone saves you, you forget they need saving too. It was an admission that reframed their entire story. For years, the world had seen Nicole as the elegant constant, calm, composed, endlessly patient. But behind that grace was a woman who had carried more than anyone realized. While Keith was on the road fighting old temptations and chasing perfection, she was holding their world together. She raised 2 daughters largely on her own, managed a global career, and still showed up beside him when the cameras rolled. Her strength had become his safety net, one he'd leaned on so often he forgot to notice the weight she was carrying. In one candid reflection, Keith said, "There were times I thought we were fine, just busy. But she was alone in that house, waiting for me to come home and be her husband, not just her headline." That line struck deeply with fans. The way he spoke of her not as the reason for the failure, but as the one who held the line as long as she could. It wasn't blame, it was acknowledgement. Nicole, true to her nature, never retaliated with bitterness. When she was asked in an interview about the divorce months later, she said, "Life changes. You love people differently over time, but you always hope they find peace." It wasn't anger, it was release. Those who knew her said she had been ready for closure long before the papers were signed, that she wanted the separation to be kind, not cruel. Keith described her as the calm in every storm. He spoke of the early years, how she stood by him when he entered rehab, how she believed he could change when he didn't believe it himself. "She saw light in me," he said, "when all I saw was noise." His words painted her not as the one who left, but as the one who stayed longer than she should have, a pattern seen too often in marriages that run out of rhythm but not respect. He also admitted that Nicole had been right about something he never wanted to face, that love can't survive on gratitude alone. "I kept thanking her for saving me," he said, "but I forgot to keep loving her the way she needed." That sentence became the quiet center of his confession, not a soundbite, but a revelation. Gratitude without attention had become its own form of distance. In the months after the divorce, Keith began performing stripped-down versions of his older love songs. Gone were the arena effects and electric solos, replaced by a single guitar, a stool, and a voice that sounded older, slower, reflective. Before one of those performances, he told the crowd, "I wrote this song for her, but I sing it now for what I learned, because of her." It was the clearest window into his heart, a man no longer haunted by scandal or pride, but by understanding. And for Nicole, who had once been defined by other people's love stories, Tom Cruise's ex-wife, Keith Urban's muse, this chapter became her quiet reclamation. She returned to Australia with her daughters, worked on smaller personal projects, and spoke about peace, not pain. Those who saw her said she looked lighter, as if the performance of a perfect marriage had finally ended and she could simply be herself again. In the end, Keith's revelation about Nicole wasn't that she failed him, but that he finally saw her, not as a star, not as a savior, but as a woman who had given him the very thing his fame could never provide: stability. And when he said she deserved peace, it wasn't a line for headlines. It was the truest sentence of his life. Because the end of their marriage wasn't the loss of love. It was the moment Keith Urban realized what real love had cost both of them. When the divorce became final in September 2025, there were no dramatic statements or teary press conferences. Just a quiet filing in Tennessee, witnessed by lawyers and acknowledged with a single paragraph in the press. For a couple who had once embodied passion and resilience, the silence felt fitting. They had started their story in private, and now they were ending it the same way, softly. Keith Urban didn't hold a press tour to promote his confession. He didn't write a tell-all or release a song that named her. Instead, he returned to what he understood best, the stage. But this time, the tone was different. During his first concert after the divorce, he opened with "Blue Ain't Your Color," and when the crowd cheered, he smiled faintly and said, "It's mine now." The audience went quiet. That moment, small and unrehearsed, said more than any statement ever could. In interviews that followed, Keith spoke less about regret and more about understanding. He said he'd learned that success doesn't heal loneliness, and that love isn't proven by endurance, it's proven by presence. You can stand beside someone for 20 years, he reflected, and still miss them if you're not really there. That single line summed up his entire story. Love lost not through anger, but through absence. Nicole, meanwhile, seemed at peace. She was seen in Sydney with her daughters, smiling without pretense, living the kind of quiet she once said she longed for. She hadn't spoken publicly about Keith since the divorce, and perhaps she never will, but her silence, like his confession, became its own kind of statement. Two people no longer performing their love, simply living with what remained of it. What lingers now isn't bitterness, but something quieter. Fans who once idolized them as proof that Hollywood marriages could last now see them differently, as proof that even the strongest bonds are fragile, and that letting go isn't always failure. Sometimes it's the only act of honesty left. For Keith, that honesty came too late to save the marriage, but not too late to redefine who he was. His new songs, slower, stripped down, more introspective, carry that evolution. In one of them he sings, "You were my reason to begin, and my lesson when it ended." It's not about pain anymore, it's about acceptance. Because in the end, Keith Urban didn't just reveal why he divorced Nicole Kidman, he revealed something far deeper, that love isn't destroyed by distance or fame, but by the quiet forgetting of how to stay close. His truth wasn't explosive, it was human, and that's what made it resonate. They were two people who found each other at the right time, built something beautiful, and then slowly outgrew it. What remains is gratitude, not for what lasted, but for what was learned. For more emotional stories, check out this video.